Hello and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, the original podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host, Andy Smith. Throughout the series, I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys and hear some incredible stories along the way. Biker Graham Field became obsessed with the TV game show Deal or No Deal, to the point where he just had to appear on it. He won $5,000 and declared he was going to ride his motorbike to Mongolia, and that is just what he did. Just a heads up, if you're listening to this podcast with kids, this podcast features a few swear words, so please be warned. Okay, let's get started. Joining me around the campfire today is Graham Field. Hello, Graham.
Hi there.
And we're very much sat around the virtual campfire because you are all the way over on the other side of Europe. Can you just tell us where you are?
I'm in the middle of Bulgaria, actually, which is where I live. And until you said we were around a campfire, I didn't even realise we were. So now I'm visualising the virtual campfire.
Well, we'll take a second just to appreciate the pop and crackle. And certainly we need a campfire here in England at the moment. It's pretty cold. I presume it's probably similar temperatures, if not colder, in Bulgaria at the moment.
We had snow in the middle of this week and the temperatures plummeted, but then we had a strong warm wind and the snow disappeared. So I was actually sitting outside having my lunch outside in the sunshine today. So, but it's that's the climate. Even when there's snow on the ground, if the sun's shining, it's warm enough to wear a t-shirt. So, which is why I live here.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Okay, let's get back to overlanding, shall we? I think I came across your name first through the Ted Simon Foundation. I think that's where I spotted you.
Right.
And then I had checked out your website and did a little more delving and found out that your story was one that was incredibly intriguing. So, you've always ridden motorbikes, is that correct?
Always. Since before I was old enough to have a driver's licence or a motorcycle licence, they've one of the constants in my life. There's not many, but one of them has definitely been motorbikes.
Yeah, and then did that kind of passion lead you on to anything else? Because I've seen a few TV interviews with you, and you've got long hair, and it kind of fulfilled my criteria of what a biker should be. And this is without wanting to stereotype too much. My kind of definition of a biker, and this is the 12-year-old me talking now, was kind of a big black motorbike, long hair, leather jacket, listens to heavy metal, and is kind of like just, I don't know, a bit raucous.
Yeah, you forgot the tattoos.
Oh, and tattoos, yeah, plenty of tattoos. And
well, I think I was the same impressionable 12-year-old because I was too impressed with, I used to buy Easy Rider magazines back in the late 70s, I've still got them, and that sort of the Dave Man image of the bearded, tattooed, Harley-riding biker, that was the thing that made this huge impression on me, and that's what I wanted to be, and I suppose that's what I am.
Yeah. So how then did you then make that transition? Because I'm sure there must be a lot of bikers in the world who kind of fit into that criteria, what we just described as a biker. But then how did you make that transition to then go to riding your motorbike through other countries and then to take on like quite a hefty overland trip?
Well, that's a very, very big question. But I suppose going back to the Easy Rider magazines, which was so influential back in the day when I was still at school, and even reading them then, I used to think, it was so, because it's an American magazine and it was Harley or nothing, and they were all, they'd slag off anything else, Jack crap or whatever. They had no time for anything but Harley. And even then I started thinking, well, this is kind of a narrow view. It's horses for courses, Yes, there are people who have ridden Harleys around the world, but if you're going to take, if you want to, get your knee down, you have a sports bike. If you want to go off road, you have a trail bike, a dual sport bike. Why would you just confine yourself to one bike? Why would you confine yourself to one country? So always, although I was influenced by Easy Riders, I suppose, even back then, plus because when you're 17 years old, you can't go out and buy a Harley when you live in the Britain in Thatcher's Britain in the early 80s. So there was always, I've never really been down on any one, well, perhaps I have been down on one kind of motorcycle, but I'm generally, I accept them all because, and I've got several different ones because it's horses for courses. But to answer that very big question, from being influenced by, Dave Mann posters and Easy Rider posters, and incidentally, I've still got on the shed wall the picture of what's their names in Easy Rider? Oh God, what are their names? Dennis Hopper and the other dude. But anyway, the two guys on their panhead chops, in the Easy Rider film. That poster that hung on my bedroom wall as a teenager, still creased and faded, hangs on my shed wall now. Yeah. And a huge influence in my life. But slowly, always ridden bikes, but didn't really. If I rode bikes for camping, it was because I was going to a bike rally, the Bulldog Bash or the Kent Customer Show or something like that. And it's a relatively recent thing that I actually started going off and doing this whole overland thing, Yeah.
So, like, from what you're talking about, it sounds very much like the kind of appeal of being a biker was, and actually I picked up on the way you said Thatcher's Britain, which makes me think that you've got a slight hint of kind of anti-establishment to you, maybe. I don't know, I'm guessing here.
We're not going to get political, but growing up, leaving school, I left school in 1981. And our careers lessons consisted of, I'm going to leave school now and I'm going to go out and get a job. What do I fancy being? And the reality was you walked out of school and there were no jobs. 300 people would apply for one apprenticeship with the electricity board. There weren't any jobs. Yeah. So, and the only reason I'm saying that is because the chances of owning a Harley Davidson in 1981 as a 17 or 18-year-old school leaver was nil. So the Dave Mann posters were all you had if you wanted that lifestyle.
Yeah. So what was the kind of appeal then for? Was it the freedom you yearned for? Was it the lifestyle? Was it the, I don't know, was it because I remember when I was a kid I used to read a lot of custom car magazines, and for me it was the whole process of actually building something from scratch kind of really appealed to me, and building it exactly how you wanted it. Was that an aspect, or what was your kind of main focus of being a biker, or was it all those things encompassed into one?
There was a lot of things. You're very influenced by your peers, and my father was dead against motorcycles, and
well, that sounds like a good enough reason.
So there's always rebellion, which is nothing bigger motivator than rebellion, And but so when I was 17, did my car test, got a car, and my friends had been. I lived in a little village in the country, so I had to rely on a dodgy bus service, whereas my friends who had mopeds suddenly had independence at 16. I had to wait till I was 17 to have my car license before I got my independence, because I wasn't allowed to have a motorbike. Having got my car license, I then had the best reason ever for getting a motorbike. I can't afford to run this car. Petrol's too expensive. Motorbikes are far more economical. So apart from rebellion, coolness, picking up chicks and all the rest of it, ultimately it was an economical thing, and to own a motorbike meant that you could travel much further for much less money. So that was probably one of the major motivators behind it. But I've always loved them. For my 10th birthday, I got a model of a Harley Davidson Electra Glide. And so it was right back then, the passion. And it's never changed. That's why, when somebody reminds me of my age now, I can find it quite a shock, because my lifestyle hasn't changed. It's pretty much the same. Still got long hair, still listen to heavy metal, still ride motorbikes. The math says I'm middle-aged, but the mentality really doesn't match that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that. I'm stuck being a perpetual 22-year-old, I think, and that's kind of the age I'm stuck at in my head. And whenever anyone asks me, I always get shocked at the words that come out of my mouth when someone asks me my age. Um, so from that love of motorbikes, then how did you kind of get into taking your first overland trip?
Well, again, I mean, that was a long time coming, because, I mean, I did the obligatory backpack around the world thing when I was quite young, but where a lot of people tend to do that, and then, their last stop in Thailand, they get their tailor-made suits and then go home, do the interview and go into the rat race. I only just got a bigger thirst for travel and continued to, and I sort of lived in the States. I wandered around India for 6 months on my own. I've backpacked through South America, and then slowly that evolved to cycling, and I cycled around China and Thailand and Sri Lanka and India, and it was so, and a lot of people, there are very mixed opinions about the long way round, and people love to slag them off, saying how it was gifted to them, it was on a plate, it was spoiled, whatever. You cannot deny that it had a huge influence on a lot of people, that motorcycling, travel or motorcycle could work. And I'd met on various trips, whether I'd been backpacking or using public transport or cycling, people who were doing it independent in their big Unimogs or on their KTMs or whatever. And I suppose the seed was slowly planted. Plus, having cycled through, mountains of China and that, it's bloody difficult. It hurts.
Yeah.
And it just seems so much easier to turn a throttle. And so it really wasn't. I mean, I'd spent some time living in the States, and I'd done sort of trips through the States and that, which is relatively easy because they speak the same language, and you can can travel up through Canada, same language still, no visas, no carnets, all the way up into Alaska. So it was a slow progression, and I did an Alaska trip with a couple of friends. This was in 2007, which was phenomenal. I mean, just brilliant, really, really good mates, brilliant trip, but was on a real, it was money rich and time poor, because the other two were career people. I don't have a career, but they had schedules, very fixed schedules, places they had to be and when they had to be there. And they were also, because they were career people, had no shortage of cash. So it was done with hotels, it was done with ferries, and it was done in a way where we did what we set out to achieve. But I realised in the middle of that trip, and I write about that in one of my books, that I am never going to do a trip like that again. For me, I'm quite happy to live on a very small budget, but I like to have the ability to, if I find a nice place, I can stay there for 3 or 4 days. I don't have a ferry or a plane to catch or a career to pick up at the end of it all. So that, I suppose, that Alaska trip in 2007 made me start thinking, right, I want to do longer distances, more time, okay with less money, but I don't want deadlines. And I think that's probably where it started.
Yeah, and I think that kind of is a typical conclusion that many overlanders kind of get to, just through undertaking trips. Like the last podcast I did, both people on there said they wished they had taken it slower. Having done another trip since then, how did you find it differed? And on that trip to Alaska, because it's a conversation my wife and I have quite often when we're travelling, is that if people are travelling with more money than us, do they then checking into hotels every night and basically having it a little bit easier, do they then have less of an adventure? By having no money, do you find that you put yourself into situations that you typically wouldn't find yourself in if you had more money and ended up in a hotel?
I think it depends on your basis for comparison. I hadn't done long solo budget overland trips when I had gone to Alaska. So with 2 friends and with an okay budget, it was an adventure to us. However, there was a point, and every day there were daily mileages that had to be done. When we started in Colorado, and when we left Colorado, 6 weeks from when we left, we had to be on a ferry at a certain place. So it was quite a sort of a strict dictated trip. But there was one point, I had a friend who lived up in very north of Canada, and we went and stayed with her, or visited her, and had dinner with her. And her parents came and we sat and we chatted. And because we chatted, they told us about a different route, a different road, what we'd see, what we'd expect, how we could do it. And because of that, we changed this rigid schedule that we had, and we did get to do a different road, and it was fabulous. And it's a very memorable point of the trip. And the reason that happened was because we stopped and we spoke to locals and we got local information, the stuff that you don't get in guidebooks and maps. And although we didn't realise it at the time, looking back, that high point was because we'd allowed ourselves time to stop and integrate. Whereas, and this is another thing, when you travel with a group, you tend not to interact so much with other people. You don't need to. You've got your company right there. You get your hotel room, you sit and drink Jägermeister or whatever, and you party on. Whereas, because we got to meet this, stay with this girl and her family. Firstly, we got to see what it was like to live in Whitehorse, what it was like to live in Canada from a local's perspective. But secondly, now as a solo traveller, this is a regular part of my travelling. Is have no option but to integrate with locals, and they're the golden moments. That's where you get the great bits of information. That's where you have the memories that last. And it's not always easy to force yourself into situations where you do have to talk to complete strangers. And when I do my presentations, I say to people, it's your body language. If you're going to sit alone in a restaurant and you're going to stare at your phone, or you're going to have a little laptop in front of you, you're no more approachable than you are if you're in a group of 3 or 4 people. But if you don't have your phone and your laptop, if you do sit there and look around you and have a smile and are open to and receptive to other people, that's when you meet them, and that's when you get your nuggets of I think what overland travel is all about, of interaction with local people.
Yeah, I think those are incredibly wise words, and I think again it's that they're kind of learnt skills to some degree, because I think quite often people will set off on an overland trip or when they go travelling, and they kind of start out as novices and they don't learn the intricacies of all these kind of little things that you're talking about, which really do help maximise what you actually get back from the trip. Yeah, I think that's incredibly wise words. So from after that Alaska trip then, how did you then undertake your next trip? Were you itching to hit the road again?
I'm always itching to travel again, nearly always. What happened was I sold my house in the UK. This would have been, when was this? 2008, something like this. And I wasn't there was a huge property bubble at the time. And in my head, I thought it was going to burst. And so I thought, I'm going to stay off the property ladder for a little while, wait for this bubble to burst, and then get a house. Yeah, 2007 or something like that. And so I went and stayed with a mate. One of the ones that I'd ridden to Alaska with, and he had this thing called a TV. I've never had a TV, and because all my toys were in storage, I didn't have an awful lot to do except get consumed by this TV. And I worked as a handyman, so I used to start early and finish early. So I used to normally be home by about 4:00 in the afternoon. And there was this thing on the TV, this program called Deal or No Deal. I knew nothing about it. People would open boxes and the audience would clap. It really didn't make sense to me. And one day I was working at a customer's house and she had it on. And I said, what is this program? I said, I go see it sometimes. There's clapping and numbers. And she sort of explained it to me. It's pretty simple. I can't believe I didn't get it. Anyway, I became really obsessed. I had a friend who was also into it, and we would be texting each other. This is before Facebook was huge and WhatsApp and everything. We'd text you, would you deal on that? Yeah, I'd deal. I wouldn't deal. It became a really unhealthy obsession, which is why, once again, I don't have a TV. And so anyway, I applied to be on the program. I applied to be on Deal or No Deal. And cut a long story short, it took a year of interviews and on-camera interviews and medical checks and police checks and God knows what else. But eventually I got to be on the show. And again, cutting a long story short, because if anybody's vaguely interested, they go to my website and they can see the original show back in 2009, I think it was, 10, 9, whatever. And anyway, I was on the show. You have this very, very big application form. One of the questions is inevitably, what would you do if you won a significant sum of money? And I rather flippantly wrote, I would do a trip that would make Charlie and Ewan's look like a trip to Tesco's. And They read it out. Noel read it out on the show, and I thought, shit, I'm committed now. So I won. I won't tell you what I won, because if you did want to watch it, but it's a very modest amount. I was really happy with it. Other people were more frustrated than me. You turned down this much money and you walked away with that? It's like, yeah, but I'm really happy with what I've got. You may be frustrated and annoyed, but I never look back. And so with a relatively, okay, I'm going to have to tell you the amount. I won £5,000, and I wanted to ride to Mongolia. When I'd been hiking in the Patagonia, and I'd met some cyclists who had cycled to Mongolia, and they told me stories about it, and that, I suppose, planted the seed. So now I wanted to ride to Mongolia. I had said, I'd said on TV, I said, I'm going to ride to Mongolia, and Noel had said to me, so what would you need to ride to Mongolia, trying to provoke me into saying, well, I'd need at least £75,000. But I kind of went the other direction of, well, I'd need a specific bike. And when you if you watch it, when you listen to it, I clearly didn't have a bloody clue what I was talking about. It was just a dream. And but anyway, so it was on national TV that I intend, with my winnings, to ride a bike to Mongolia. So show was over. I got my £5,000 check. I spent a winter looking for a bike. I mean, the only bikes I'd really had before, I'd always sort of had a Harley in my life. I knew it wasn't going to work. I'd had XT500s, which are fine, but I probably needed something a little bit. Oh, and I'd had the occasional sports bike, a Triumph Sprint. And I knew none of those would work, so I needed a specific bike. And there was this KLR 650 on eBay. It was advertised in the wrong section, so no one was bidding on it. And I got it super cheap, about 750 quid. It didn't come with panniers. It had pannier racks, but no panniers, because he wanted to keep them because he had some nice stickers. I didn't know anything about KLR 650s. As time passed, I realised that these things are like a religion in the States. You can't travel through any part of North America without seeing them. So I got myself quite an iconic bike, which are kind of rare on our side of the Atlantic. So slowly over the course of the winter, and on eBay, I sold my Scale Electrics, I bought some panniers, and I just really bartered to get this bike ready for this trip. And it was an unthinkable distance to ride all the way to Mongolia on this bike that I paid 750 quid for. You know, if I get to Ukraine, that will be incredible. If I make it into Kazakhstan, that will just be euphoric. If I get as far as Mongolia, my God, I mean, how far away is that? That is an unthinkable distance. But slowly, like any journey, day by day, I kept heading east. And eventually, again, to cut a long story short, there is a book about it, I made it to Mongolia, which is when I realised it was a little short-sighted, because Mongolia is a landlocked country in the centre of the biggest landmass on the planet. It's not famous for its ports. You have got to go somewhere from there. And China is a shitload of bureaucracy. North Korea is not famous for its tourism. Japan you need a carnet for. I'm really running out of options of where I could go. Incidentally, the bike is using so much oil, and it really isn't going to make it back to the UK. And anyway, now the year is getting on. It's getting cold. So I was in Ulaanbaatar. I was waiting for some parts for my bike, and I met this German girl, and she had a map of Russia, and she was heading back west, and she didn't need all the pages east of where we were. So she gave me those pages of her map, and I realised that I could travel through Siberia and get to Vladivostok, and perhaps I could ship my bike back from Vladivostok. So I travelled the Trans-Siberian. Now we're moving into sort of autumn time, and it was cold. It was bloody cold. I mean, obviously not as cold as it gets, but it was cold for me on a little bike. And got to Vladivostok, but it was going to cost, because I had such an inexpensive bike, it was going to cost me 4 times what the bike had cost me to ship it back. Yet you have to leave Russia. If you enter Russia with a vehicle, you have to leave with that vehicle. And if the bike could treat me too well, it'd just throw it off the end of the dock. And there was a bike club. There's a bike club called the Iron Tigers in Vladivostok. And I met up with them. And in the end, I said, you know what? Just have it. Just have my bike. And they said, we don't want it. I said, we got 200 bikes. We don't need your bike anyway. It would be really expensive to try and register it. It's like, shit, I can't even give it away. So eventually, the wonders of the internet. I found I don't know how I found it. There was this guy, and he'd done that. He got as far as Vladivostok, and then gone on to South Korea and shipped his bike from there. And somehow I got hold of his number, and so via Skype I made a call to this number, and this lady answered, this older lady. And I said, look, you don't know who I am. I've seen a forum with your son's name. I'm calling you from Vladivostok. Apparently your son shipped his bike from South Korea. And she said, oh, yeah, or this guy. She said, yeah, that's my son. And she was super mum. She just reeled off numbers and names and people I should call. So I'm sitting in this little hotel room in Vladivostok, and super mum is just telling me everything I need on how to be an overland motorcyclist. And so anyway, I went to South Korea and managed to put my bike on one of these big roll-on, roll-off ferries that transports the Kia and the Hyundai cars that they manufacture in South Korea. And they're not interested in people like me and my personal effects. But it was really as a favour, and they took a token payment. And 40 days later, my bike ended up back in Southampton, and I flew back. And that was the completion of my first big solo overland trip to Mongolia, and then a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, that, to be honest, that sounds like probably one of the best shipping experiences I've heard. Well, easiest. Well, I'm sure it wasn't easy.
It was easy, actually, because and this is where sometimes you can be paralysed by forums, by contradictory information, by negativity. I didn't have any of that. All I had was a bit of optimism and a phone number.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps if I'd have left thinking, how am I going to ship my bike back, who knows? But it was the unknown, and I think that's really what defines adventure is. And it's also my excuse for not researching very much, because research bores me, is to go into the unknown relatively unprepared and have the ability to deal with situations as they arise. It was a ball and chain for a little while, that damn KLR, because I didn't know what I was going to do with it and how I was going to get out of the situation. But because time was on my side, I was able to find a solution.
Yeah. No, that sounds. I think that kind of open-minded attitude and willingness to dive into the unknown is certainly a skill or an attribute that every overlander should have, really. And again, I think you can learn to kind of relax, I think, to some degree. And I'm sure some people find it a lot harder than others to kind of get into that mode of thinking. But it's certainly beneficial. And throughout this whole time, you were keeping a diary, right, of all your adventures? We spoke about earlier, or I spoke about constants in my life. The other one is I've always kept a diary. For nearly 30 years now, every single day of my life, I've documented. It's a passion that I have, and I really enjoy it. And it started because back in the 80s, when I probably partied a little bit harder than I should have done, and people would reminisce about various events and things. I was like, I don't remember that at all. Was I there? Yeah, you were there. Don't remember because this happened. Yeah.
Oh, I thought, what is the point in having all these good times if I don't remember them? So I started scribbling down in a diary. And that, like anything, if you do it frequently, you get better at it. And so now, I mean, I've got nearly 30 diaries, and kept in fireproof boxes because, God, if I lost them, it'd be like a lobotomy. And I keep my diaries every day, every single day. And so all my books are written in diary format because I think that's how a journey. It doesn't start with the big drama or the accident or the sex scene or the fight or anything. It starts with the packing of the bike and the leaving the familiar, because that's how a journey is. That's how a diary is. So a lot of the comments I get, a lot of feedback I get, people say, "Well, I feel like I was there with you," and I think that's because it slowly unfolds a day at a time. And equally, you don't lie to your diary, so it is very truthful. It's blatantly honest. When I'm having a shit time, I say I'm having a shit time, and so it doesn't necessarily paint a glamorous picture of the overland adventure, the world travel, because it's not always glamorous. Sometimes it's just hard work. Sometimes it's miserable. Sometimes you wonder why the hell you're doing it. It's just life. Life is good and life is bad. It just happens to be life on the road. And sometimes it's euphorically fantastic and you want to do it forever, and other times it's shit and you just want to go home.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few times actually that you mentioned the book, but you've also written 2 other books. But I just want to focus on the first book really, for the time being. When you kind of wrote it, and again the title is very optimistic. It's In Search of Greener Grass, and that kind of leads me on to thinking that you were kind of looking for something. And just then when you were talking, kind of. I don't know. I think there's a certain level of kind of optimism, and the title, you know, is am I onto something here? Were you looking for something, or am I fishing in dirty waters?
You found something. Yes, life wasn't fantastic. I think that one of the biggest single motivations to travel is living in Essex. And life wasn't brilliant. And also, as I touched on earlier, you know, my lifestyle really hasn't changed that much. But my friends grew up, and they got married, and they had kids, and they did all that stuff. And I didn't. So there were less and less people to party with. Not just party. It's not all about partying. Actually, that is. And but there was less people to do things. And I've waited before for people to say they're going to do something, whether it's go to a festival or do a rally or go off on a trip, and then they just don't because their life gets in the way of their plans. And so I was in search of greener grass. I was in search of something better because my wonderful social life had slowly dwindled away, and I was looking for something better. So. And generally, I'm most happy in life when I'm searching for happiness. And so that's what I did. And I found it several times. And I think happiness is like a rainbow, you know. You see it, you have to stop and appreciate it when it's there, because it won't last. Not going to last forever. And then you move on. And that trip was a huge learning experience. It was incredibly introspective. And there's as much going on inside the helmet as there is outside. But ultimately, was it life-changing? I don't know. It might have been a little bit life-changing. It was life-changing insofar as I'm not getting back on a bicycle. I'm not throwing on a backpack. The next trip is also going to be on a motorbike. So in that respect, it was life-changing.
Yeah, enlightening.
Yeah.
And you just briefly talked then about kind of being introspective and living inside the kind of helmet, and I think I read somewhere, or I'd heard in another interview that you'd done that you'd been a truck driver for 17 years. Is that right?
Yeah.
And one thing that I found quite interesting through the people I've spoken to, especially people who've undertaken long motorbike trips or bicycle trips, is the kind of introspective journey that you go on. And I think you have to have a certain mentality to do those trips, because you spend quite a lot of time on your own or with your own thoughts, which I think can be just, I don't know, kind of. I think you learn a lot about yourself when you're put into those kind of situations. So that I found quite interesting. On your return, then, why did you feel the need to write a book then about your experiences? How did that come about?
Well, I suppose I heard it a lot through my life prior to them. I tell my stories and people say, you should write a book, you should write a book. And yeah. And I was very proud of my achievement, what I'd done, how I'd done 15,000 miles in about 100 days on a £5,000 budget, so about £50 a day, on a very small, like I said, the bike was about 750 quid. When the bike was fully kitted out, with its panniers, with its new tyres, with its spare tyres, with everything in its panniers, the whole thing stood me at £2,000. And one of the reasons, apart from the lack of finances, that I had such an inexpensive bike was because I really didn't know what I was about to encounter. If something all went tragically wrong on the steppe of Kazakhstan, a £2,000 bike, you can afford to walk away from it. You're not looking at a 15 grand GS or something. It's something that you could walk away from if it all went tragically wrong, and it wouldn't be a huge burden. I mean, the irony is that I've done so many trips on that bike now that it has such a huge sentimental value that I would do anything to keep it with me. But I mean, that's just something that grew. But so it was. Sorry, what was the question again?
It was, why did you feel the need to kind of write a book, or how did, not feel the need, but how did it kind of come about?
Well, I was incredibly proud of my achievement, and I did consider while I was riding at some point, I wonder if I could do this in a book. I had a friend at one point, I don't know at what point, in Ukraine or wherever, because I'm not really very internet literate or computer literate, and I said, can you make me a blog and then tell me how to write in it? Because prior to that, I just wrote mass emails to everybody. And this, again, was before Facebook was a big thing. So, you didn't feel the need to photograph your every meal or puncher or whatever. And so she made me a blog, told me how to get into it. So then I would write my experiences, put them in a blog, post my blog. And that got more and more followers, more and more popular. And then I remember I was considering, could I write a book? Could I write a book about this? And I was in Mongolia and I was having a fantastic day, riding beautiful scenery, beautiful roads, tracks. And I thought, I'm in search of greener grass. And I thought, man, someone's used that. I bet someone's used that. It took about 3 days before I found the internet and could Google in search of greener grass. And apart from someone who had written a little article about cameras and focusing and light and apertures and how you can get greener grass, no one had written anything called In Search of Greener Grass. Right, that's my title. And so really, I sat down when I got back to the UK. I sat down, and it was a freezing cold winter, the winter of 2009 and 2010, I think it was. And I just sat there next to a little electronic radiator, and I banged out 150,000 words, and
wow.
And in a diary format. I had three things. I had the photograph to remind me of terrain. I had my diaries to remind me of events, and I had my voice recorder, which generally reminds me of the mood I'm in, because I can tell by my voice the mood I'm in. So I had those three things, and I had this massive manuscript. Anyway, I won't go all through the bores of publishing, but it became a book, and I went to my very first show was when it was still the BMF show in Peterborough. I think this is in 2012 now, when it was finally published. And optimistically took 400 books with me, not really knowing about what you sell at shows. And I remember the first guy who came up, he showed a little bit of interest. I had my wallpaper pasting table and my books on it. That was pretty much it. And he picked it up and he had a look and he put it back down again. And I remember there was no dignity. I absolutely humiliated myself. Going, please buy my book, please buy my book, please buy my book. And he said, I'll come back for it. So yeah, that's what I'd say if I didn't want it as well. But he did come back for it, and a lot of other people bought it as well. And that was it. And also at that show, I met this guy who luckily I'd never heard of, because if I had, I would have been a bit starstruck. I met this guy called Sam Manicom. Yeah. And no introduction needed, I'm sure. And he took me under his wing and said, I've been hearing about this long-haired bloke who's selling me his books off a wallpaper pasting table. I said, oh, yeah, it's me. And gave him a book, and he said, would you like me to review it? Yeah, all right. And he said, are you going to go to the hub at the Horizons Unlimited? Well, I don't know. Well, why don't you do a presentation? Ooh, I could. I also met Paddy Tyson, who ran Overland magazine, which at the time had like 3 issues. It was just fledgling magazine. And that show, I got so many connections. But ultimately, and I won't tell anybody this, you wouldn't be talking to me, no one would have heard of me. There wouldn't be a second and a third book if it wasn't for Sam Manicom, because he is such a selfless man. He doesn't see any other writer, any other traveller as competition. He sees them as somebody who's helping to spread the word across the planet on overland travel, how good it is. And because of that, and because of his connections and his help and his belief and his selflessness, and I'm not getting paid to say this. It just grew, and In Search of Greener Grass just became. I suppose, would you call it a cult hit? I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to call it a cult hit. It's got this little cult following. People I get messages all the time of people who like it and are inspired by it, or had read a certain line and repeat that line back to me. I love this line, you know. And I think it was because it was blatant truth. It was unedited, unpolished, realistic words from the road, and thank God it was became popular. It's something that I'm really proud of, and I'm really honoured when people say, "Oh, you know, it influenced me, or it inspired me, or whatever." So yeah, my first ever book as well. Would you believe it? How lucky am I?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I can't think of a better way to be kind of inducted. At that point, were you aware it was called Overland Travel, or were you just a biker going to Mongolia? Were you aware that there was such a scene involved?
Not particularly. I mean, I had used the Horizons Unlimited site,
yeah,
but I don't know when overlanding became a phrase that we're all familiar with now. Because before, if you had panniers on your bike, you were touring. You bought a tourer. And then at some point, there was this crossover. I don't know whether it was knobbly tyres or monoshock or what it was, but all of a sudden it became overlanding.
Yeah, and at that point when you had written your first book, were you aware of Jupiter's Travellers then, and that whole scene, and how influential were they in helping you to realise your kind of writing passions?
I became more aware and that was one of... There were two huge rewards from that first book. The first was the fact that I'd done something that I'd said I'd wanted to do for a long time. I completed and written a book, and that was a wonderful achievement in itself. And in the doing so, and when I did it, I immersed myself in it. I mean, 16 hours a day, and I was reliving each day through my diaries as I wrote it, to the point where I was writing about a day in July, and outside it was January, and I couldn't work out why I couldn't see sunshine or sunflowers or sunshine. You know? I really was immersing. So I lived the whole trip again, day by day. I'd say in the comfort of my own house, but it wasn't comfortable. It was bloody freezing. And secondly, when it did get launched, I met all these people who I was unaware of, people who had done some significant overland trip and then turned it into some kind of business, whether they were magazine people like Overland, whether they were authors like Sam Manicom, whether they were fabricators like Zen Overland and Gabe Bolton. Whatever they were, these people had this zest for life, this passion, this absolute thrill and drive, and that what was lacking before. That's what made me leave, because everybody was going off and playing Happy Families and talking about the snooker on the telly or the specials in Mataland. And now I found these people who were just driven and excited and passionate, and that was the second reward of the book. And so slowly I got accepted, I suppose, or I think I was accepted, I don't know, into this. I pushed myself upon this crowd of people who I was unaware of. Yeah, you know, and then there's the real, in my ratings, the hierarchy, people like Nick Sanders, who I could never compete with what he does, and I would never want to do what he does, but I'm in awe of his stamina, his ability, and what he does. And so that whole scene, whenever you go to Horizons Unlimited or an Overland event or a big motorcycle show, Motorcycle Live, whatever, those people who you see with their books and their tours and their magazines and their products, they're the people who started being a bit more of my social life. And inspiration breeds inspiration. When you're around those sort of people, you can't help but be influenced. And it's a wonderful group of people to be around.
Yeah. And just to focus on the first thing you said there, when you were talking about going through the kind of writing process and you were fully immersed in kind of revisiting your trip, by kind of going through that, did it help you kind of process it and give you I don't know, did you find a kind of new way to appreciate what you'd done again, and did it highlight the fact that, you know, what you had achieved was actually really something quite amazing?
I think in the revisiting of it, it was the fun of it of just going through the trip day by day. That was revisiting, but the real achievement was the completion of the manuscript. I mean, I've done this 3 times now, where I've completed a book, and because I do it so single-mindedly, I have a pretty, I don't only ride solo. I write solo and I live solo. So my life is quite a selfish life, and it can be because not many people depend on me. I've got a couple of cats now that want feeding, but other than that, it's not a big deal. So when I do get to the penultimate chapter and feel that whole thing coming together, that is such a wonderful feeling. And so I think, to answer your question, the writing of the book wasn't so much feeling the achievement of the trip. I think I was relatively aware of that at the time, but the completion of the manuscript, the actual putting down, and then you do your word count, and it's like, oh my God, 147,000 words. Wow. I wonder how many of them I spelt correctly. And then, of course, and then, so after that, so you have this brief euphoric moment where you've completed it, but that's just, and then you go, and like I said, I don't want to get into publishing, but then you have the copy editor who rips out your heart, stomps on it, and every paragraph that you agonized over, he pulls it apart, saying, it's superfluous, it's losing the flow, it's not necessary, you've said this already. And then he kills your baby and rebuilds it, and then you have to go through every other aspect of it. And then you have a second euphoric moment when, after all of that, you physically hold your book in your hand for the first time, when a pallet of 1,000 or whatever has arrived at in your mum's garage.
Yeah.
And you look at it and you think, oh yeah, that's all right. So there, and then, but that moment of euphoria only lasts for a few seconds, when you think, shit, I've got to sell this lot. And then when you sell them, you think, oh God, I've got to get them reprinted. It never ends.
So just there, you're talking about, so you were self-distributing all these as well, or did you have how did that work with the publisher? Was the publisher distributing them as well? Or was the network of kind of Amazon all in place at that point? Or
we could do a whole program about that. But anyway, the first one was published through a publisher. In Search for Greener Gods done through a publisher. So I had distribution, I had all that stuff. What I didn't get was hardly any money, because they take all of that. Yeah. But it wasn't really for money. And then the second one, you know what? I'm not going to get into all of this. The point is, books don't sell themselves. And if you look on Amazon at any one time, there are 3 million books for sale, and everybody can reel off people like J.K. Rowling or whoever wrote 50 Shades of Grey. For those 2 or 3 people, Stephen King, whatever, who are famous, rich authors, there are another 299 million who straight, just because you've written a book, you don't just sit back collecting royalty checks and sipping champagne. It doesn't work like that. Luckily, I didn't write some chick lit or some romantic novel. I wrote a book about overland travel. I've written books about overland travel. I know exactly where my audience is. Yeah. So when I go to shows, overland shows and what have you, I can find my audience. And although I love to kid myself and think that it has crossover value, and it does, because people, 89-year-old old women have read it and said they liked it, but I can find my niche audience very easily. And so you have to go to the shows, you have to work it, and initially it's just cold selling, really, and when your confidence is up, and you can say, you really need to read this book. This will really inspire you. This will really help you sort out your trip and work out what you need to do if you want to follow your dreams. And when you're having a bad day, you feel like you're just saying, me. Do you want to read about me? This is all about me. but yeah, I mean, you have to work it. And if you haven't got, unless you're writing Bridget Jones's Baby and you've got this massive publishing campaign and this huge, expensive advertising budget, you're going to have to get out there and hit the streets and work it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a lesson learned also, and I think that same kind of attitude is one that can be carried across to people who want to undertake overland trips, because it's not easy to do and it can be daunting and it is a big task. So I think having that kind of relentless attitude and just to kind of get your head down and get on with it is certainly probably skills you acquired as an overlander but didn't really know.
There are a lot of similarities, I think, between the publishing industry and the selling of books and the going off on a journey.
Yeah, certainly an adventure, both of them. Okay, so after that, well, we've talked about the first book briefly, but I know there are at least 2 others. So what happened next? How did you kind of follow in the glory of your first trip and then writing that first book? Did you have an urge to do another trip?
I totally did, and I always do. But having done the trip and having written the book, I thought, well, that was easy. And so I thought I'd do it again. And no, I did have I've always, and the thing is, and anybody will tell you, it doesn't matter how you travel, as soon as you get out of your familiar circle, you find other people who have travelled, and they will inevitably tell you stories of places they have been. And there are places you haven't been, and you make a mental note. You say, well, that sounds good. I'd kind of like to go there. I'd kind of like to do that. The second trip, which is in the book Eureka, was an interesting trip because I'm not sure, well, I probably am sure, I probably did that trip. I left on that trip thinking it was going to be a trip for a second book. And that is all the wrong reasons to do a trip. I thought I was experienced and knowledgeable because I'd just ridden all the way to South Korea on my own. But there was an awful lot more to learn. And again, the story unfolds in the book. But basically, the trip went totally wrong, because I was doing it for all the wrong reasons. And when I got to the Caspian Sea in Azerbaijan with the intentions of heading east to what's collectively known as the Stans, I realised I was pushing against something, and I had been pushing against something since I left the UK, which wasn't moving. I was banging my head against a wall. I wasn't enjoying it. I was enjoying aspects of it, but overall it was a chore. And there was a point when I reached Baku in Azerbaijan and was booked on a ferry to cross over into Turkmenistan.
Yeah, the notorious ferry.
Yeah. Which you will read nothing good about.
Well, you could have probably written the book on the ferry.
yeah, or waiting for it. Anyway, I just had to have this moment of honesty. It's like, why am I doing this? And I wrote an email. Actually, I wrote a Word document and to a friend, and I didn't post it, but I did talk to her, and she said, well, send me the letter that you wrote. So then I turned the Word document into an email, sent it to her, and she said, well, look, you know the answer, turn around, you don't want to do it. And that is massive failure. It's failure of all the, because now a few people know who I am. Now I've got a following. Now Facebook is a bigger deal. Now I've told everybody what I'm going to do, and everybody has these expectations. It might not be quite as big a deal as saying it on a national TV game show, but still, if I failed in myself, I failed in my ability to write a book, I failed in everything if I turn around. And but I did, and this was a huge decision. And I turned around. And I gave up on it. Gave up on the book, gave up on the trip, gave up on everything. Fuck it, it's not working. Doing it for all the wrong reasons. And but the second I made that decision, it's as if the planets aligned and everything fell into place. And I wasn't heading straight back home. I didn't have a home to go to. It was rented out. And I slowly crawled through Georgia, went through roads I hadn't done before, saw the stunning scenery that northern Georgia has to offer. I went down into Armenia, which is another country which was very diverse, very exciting. Spent a long time travelling through Turkey on the way back, went back to Bulgaria, which had such a huge impact on me that I live here now, and then carried on through former Yugoslav states. Met some people, regrouped with some old friends, met a few old girlfriends, did some various things I probably shouldn't. And then when I did get back, I thought, well, let's see if I can do a book. Again, ultimately, blatantly honest, because it's my diary. And because of this, and when Eureka was published, I was so dubious. I wasn't sure if it was going to work. And the response was, oh my God, I thought that too. I didn't realise it was okay to say that. I didn't realise it was okay to be living the dream and not enjoying it. So, yeah, it failed insofar as I didn't achieve the destinations I wanted to. But because I still wrote about it, because I did turn the trip around, not just literally, but also, as far as the fun factor goes, it actually still worked. And it was still 15,000 miles, just like the first trip. It was 15,000 miles, it was 100 days, it was a $5,000 budget. It just happened to be a round trip, so it doesn't look nearly as impressive on the world map. But it was still significant. Not probably as significant to me, but far more significant because I did it, I failed, I admitted I failed, and because of that, I sort of won.
Yeah, and I think that could have probably made for a more interesting book to some degree, because you went on an incredible kind of emotional journey, I think, which to some degree I think people like a little bit of drama, I think, when they in these kind of books and adventures. So by kind of doing that, I think you inadvertently put yourself in an awkward position where you kind of forced yourself to make some pretty tough decisions. Would I be right in saying that, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And you never stop learning, ever. And just because I did my first trip and thought I'm now Mr. Experienced Overland, how wrong I was. And yeah, someone said the phrase to me, second trip-itis. They said that's what it was, and that's possibly true. I was far too confident, far too blasé, thought I'd learned it all, and I hadn't. And possibly second trip-itis occurred, and I made the best of it.
Yeah. So from there then, that book, how was that book received? Because I presume you already had quite a prolific fan base at that point. Was it? Well, I think in the scheme of things,
I could put myself in situations where several people knew my name. I don't think that's a prolific fan base.
Well, I don't know. I've seen the number of reviews you've got on Amazon. I think it's certainly a wildly read kind of book. Widely read.
Well, okay, then my prolific fan base were ecstatic at the second publication. It was, thank God, received well, because there was doubt, am I a one-book wonder? And it was received well. It really was. And I think it's not a secret. I think my winning
your formula.
My winning, that's the one. Thank you. I'm not very good with words, clearly. My winning formula is honesty, and people can relate to that. And if I'd have tried to big up Eureka as being the trip as being a success, I would have been seen as a failure. But because all I did was play it as an honest account, as a failed destination, then people could relate. And I think that was what saved it.
Yeah. I think there's, I don't know, the way you kind of refer to it though as a failure, but even if you do consider it to be a failure, you've still achieved more than all the people who will sit at home on the sofa and just think about doing the trip. So I think there's a valuable lesson to learn that, even at that point when it didn't feel like it was going right, and the trip may have been considered a failure, I think it's still way more successful than a lot of people who just have an idea or an inkling or don't even get off the sofa to start following their dreams. So I think that's quite a valuable lesson, I don't know, for our listeners, I think, to some degree.
Possibly, but and I say this a lot, but when I meet people at the shows and they say, I did a trip on my bike, it was nothing to compare to yours, and I have to tell them, look, it's not a competition.
Yeah.
Just packing your panniers and going away for a weekend. And I'll go to a show, and on a Sunday someone will turn up at this show and say, yesterday I camped on Dartmoor and we're at the show tonight, and then tomorrow on the way back we're going to stay here. And I was like, well, that's more than I've done. I'm just staying in my van and then going back to the computer. So you've won. If it's a competition, you've won. Yeah. It's not a competition. It's just about, it doesn't matter whether it's for a weekend or whether you've sold your cats and disappeared off of your life. It's just about appreciation the fact that you have a tent and some panniers and the independence to go off and spend the night somewhere, self-contained, and do your own thing. You don't even have, referring to people in Britain, you don't even have to get a ferry. You can stay within the country. It's not about distance, it's not about time, or even destination. You don't have to have a dog nearby, you do you?
Yes, I do, and it just shook right next to my face.
But it's just about getting out there anywhere and doing it and getting off the couch, just getting off the couch, and then you've succeeded.
Yeah. I think what's also important as well is and I think this is having spoken to, because I'm generally an overlander with four wheels, and having spoken to a lot of bikers and cyclists as well, and 4x4 overlanders, I think people have slightly different intentions depending on their means of transport. And I think a lot of cyclists, it's the challenge of cycling a certain distance. And I think that's similar to some degree with people on motorbikes. But I think certainly one of the main ways they differentiate, and again I'm pigeonholing massively here and doing things that I shouldn't really be doing and stereotyping people. But one thing I've noticed is people have slightly different intentions, like we were talking about. And I think one thing that's really important is the kind of attitude to the world and being able to look at the world around you in a new way when you're traveling. And I think that attitude is, you don't have to leave your own country. That attitude, you can travel in the same way in your own country and just be open and to new things, and the way you interpret them and the way you process them and the way you think about them. And I think that's something that's very valuable that I've certainly learned as I travel, is having a new appreciation of the world around me. And it's something that you said that was right at the very beginning on your Alaska trip, where you wanted to travel slower and slow down, and I think that's where it comes from. And I think if you rush and take kind of like speedy overland trips, you don't spend the time taking in all that stuff and processing it, and it's more about getting from A to B in a designated time. And that's something that I've it's been a massive life lesson for me. And I think that to some degree it may be a bit tenuous, but your third book, Different Natures and the Spaces in Between, I think, I haven't read it, but to some degree I think that's what you're talking about, to some degree, just being really aware, hyper aware of your surroundings, but also how you interpret them and how you kind of deal with the things that you see and how you process them, and you go on a kind of internal journey. Was that the kind of right idea for Different Natures and the Spaces in Between?
It was. Different Natures is a real gamble, because I've got this stock of diaries, and I wondered if I could delve into them and recall some old or some previous motorcycle trips. And so Different Natures is 3 different trips, and it does. It is from the absolute ignorance of the first living in they all begin and end in Colorado, because I spent a lot of my life living in Colorado in the States, and the absolute ignorance of wrong bike, wrong clothing, wrong time of year, and going off for a ride anyway, and just screwing everything up. There's 3 different journeys, and the first journey was about 10 states over about almost as many days, and which was fun, but could have been done so much better. The second one it covers the Alaskan trip, which, as I say, planted seeds, but again wasn't really my way of travelling. And the third one was a solo trip, which again started in Colorado, leaving in middle of winter, heading down into warmer Texas, and then down into Mexico, right down as far south as the Guatemalan border, which was a lot more time and a lot less money, but the money didn't matter because, I had plenty of time and it was okay, and you can live on burritos and stuff. So it's Different Natures, not the Different Natures of the cold Arctic climate and the
Okay.
hot, not just the hot high desert and the oceans and the different natures, but also the different natures within as you grow and evolve and learn and stuff. So sometimes my titles are clever, too damn clever for their own good. I mean, spelling Eureka with the U, with the biggest, stupidest fucking thing I ever did, because people search for it and they write it with an E and they don't find it. But it was Eureka with a U because I did a U-turn. I had a Eureka moment, my epiphany. It was so damn clever, but it didn't work when it came to sales. But different natures is different natures in two respects. Different natures of climate, but different natures within as well.
Yeah, the duality. I like that duality in it. That's good. So what have you learned throughout all these books? And being an overlander, has it changed your life in any profound way in how you kind of look at the world, or has it been such a long, slow, kind of gradual change that it's not one that's noticeable?
It probably
it's a very broad question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, it's a very intense question. But the thing that immediately comes to mind when you say that, and it's probably not necessarily the answer you wanted, but when it changed yes, of course it changed, because I became, you travel through Turkey and Iraq and you go through Muslim countries and Islamic countries and you meet these wonderful, hospitable, generous people, and then you see all these shit headlines and this hatred, and it's made me, what I realised was, I love to do presentations. It's probably the thing I enjoy, one of the things I enjoy the most. And I started to get on my soapbox and started saying about, you're brainwashed by the media. Stop listening to the media. Get out there and travel. Have you ever even been to a Muslim country? Have you ever even met a Muslim? Da 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 da. And people stop laughing. And I like to make my presentations entertaining. They generally are. And I like making people laugh. But when I got on my little soapbox, when I became a raving, ranting lefty, I left my audience behind, and I had to find some very careful middle ground. Yes, of course travelling changed me. Travelling changed everybody. It's free thinking. It makes you realise what bigoted, contradictory, agenda-driven bullshit the media is. And anybody who's listening to this podcast knows that. I'm preaching to the choir. But sometimes, okay, I live in Bulgaria now. There's this Bulgarian Facebook group called British Expats in Bulgaria. And it was occasionally useful for national holidays or where can I find some insurance or how do I get a GP or whatever. But what it was mainly full of was bigoted Daily Mail reading drunks who contradicted anything that anybody said and cut them down. So I wrote to the administrator suggesting that possibly they should change the name of their site from British Expats in Bulgaria to British Immigrants in Bulgaria. And perhaps they might be a little bit more sympathetic to the plea of the Syrians who are at our borders. I wasn't entered into any kind of discussion. I was blocked. And I decided at that point the most vindictive thing I can do to these stupid little motherfuckers is to leave them in their ignorance. And this is how overlanding changes you, because you become worldly wise, because you know that people everywhere are lovely, and you can't tarnish any single group with anything, because we are all individuals. And I just have to sometimes listen to myself, shut up and take a step back, because you can't argue with a sick mind. You just have to be with like people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Actually, it's and to be honest, I think we're rolling on the hour, and that seems like an incredibly poignant place to stop, because there's so much truth in just what you just said. Is seemingly a good full stop to an incredibly interesting conversation. I'm sure you'll agree Graham's passion really comes through when talking about motorbikes and the world around him. Foremost, I would say Graham is a biker, and secondly, a traveller, although the two are obviously well intertwined. That is neither here or there though. What is important, like nearly everyone else we've met through the entire course of the podcast, is that having the correct attitude is the most important attribute when attempting to do anything like this. Be sure to check out Graham's website, grahamfield.co.uk, where you will find links to all 3 of his books. You can also watch his appearance on Deal or No Deal. If you like our podcast, please subscribe on iTunes and write us a review, as this helps boost our podcast up the listings. We are also Overland Tribe leaders on the new autofocus social media platform Drive Tribe. Sign up, search Overlanding Podcast and join our tribe. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we would love to hear from you. Email us at aroundtheworldin800days@mail.com, or you can get in touch with us via our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com, where you will find links to all our social media channels. Please like, share, bump, and give us a thumbs up along the way. As usual, many thanks for joining us around the campfire. That's it for this week. Thanks. Goodbye.